help women save lives and peacefully end abortion where you live.
I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired.
You were serious about that?
Be inspired to change hearts and minds by joining over 1 million volunteers taking part in the global movement happening in your neighborhood.
She says, pray that I can get through this abortion. And I said, oh, no. So she went ahead and went into the abortion clinic. And she just came out. She told us, I'm not going to get the abortion. We just had a baby saved. We had a baby saved in Memphis today. Praise the Lord.
This is the 40 Days for Life podcast with your host, Sean Carney.
Hello. Thank you for joining us today on the 40 Days for Life podcast. I'm Sean Carney, the president of 40 Days for Life, and your host for this podcast, which is dedicated to helping you end abortion where you live. And we are going to continue our string of non-confrontational, controversial topics. And we're going to talk about IVF and Alabama wrapping themselves in glory. How dare them for the consistency to protect life all the way from the time of conception. So we will discuss that. We will also touch on personhood, what this means. Will it go state to state? This is a big topic, and for a long time, IVF has been very much under the radar, and we are seeing in a post-Roe America that people are starting to think about these things now that it is sent back to the states, and you have places where abortion has been banned. You have places where unborn children are actually protected. So does that apply to children that are frozen, to embryos that are frozen? And that is the topic of today. And somebody who has been frozen before, actually himself, is Mr. Steve Carlin from Madison, Wisconsin. Although y'all have had a light winter.
We have had a light winter, the lightest that I can remember in maybe 20 years. And now I'm here in Texas, so I'm completely thawed out, so no longer frozen. My heart is filled with warmth and love.
It was 83 degrees today in Texas.
Yeah,
and
not bad.
I know we're stuck like inside working, but it's just awesome weather. So we're glad that you're here. You've had snow though?
We've had snow, but less than usual and for shorter duration than usual.
Now, is this like awesome? Baseball season starting, summer's coming, or does rational negative Steve come in and be like, on Cinco de Mayo, we're going to get 9 feet of snow? Like God is withholding his justice, but it's coming.
No, I don't think that's a problem. But ultimately, when spring comes, that means that winter is coming. So
I walked into that one because winter's always coming. There is no joy. There's no good.
It's either here or it's coming. There's
it's
no
either
other
here
option.
Or it's coming.
It's like we talked about last week, memento mori, death is coming for all of us.
Yes.
Winter is coming for all of us in Wisconsin.
Okay. Well, there's no winter here. Thank God. It
No.
feels great outside. And we're joined by Heather Gardner.
Yep.
Who's always full of spring.
Sure.
There we go.
We'll go with that.
We'll go with that. It's much better than something else I was going to say. Okay. So we've put IVF in. We put IVF in What to Say When.
We did, yeah. It's one of the 2 chapters that we weren't necessarily preaching to the choir, where we get a little bit of pushback from our own constituents here.
And we will get pushback. So we are going to acknowledge something that is inevitable. There are very well-intentioned people who are infertile, who believe, through no fault of their own actually, that this is a gift from God. You can, through an artificial process, create a baby. You have to create multiple babies for this to be successful. So maybe 1, 2 survive, hopefully 1. And the other children that are conceived in this process are either discarded or they're frozen. So we have 600,000 frozen embryos in the United States of America right now. I've been interviewed about this a lot. I was interviewed earlier today, and the lady asked, how many are discarded? Like, do we know that? And I said, I don't think anyone knows that. IVF is very unregulated. It's a tug at the heart issue. These people want a child. You're supposed to be pro-life. What's wrong with you? But this is what happens when you get into a brave new world. and we have definitely created this. The state of Alabama has, I believe, wrapped themselves in glory again. But this is so good culturally because a lot of people, I've met a lot of people, and they're like, I've never even thought about this as an ethics thing. Just like I thought you go to a fertility clinic, they do some stuff, and then maybe you'll get a kid. And that's all they should know. I mean, they don't think about the process. But when you think about the process, conception is happening. We are creating people, and then we don't need them. So we either toss them out or we freeze them. So why don't you give a background of what happened in Alabama?
So there's an Alabama fertility clinic, and there's all sorts of different ways, both moral and illicit ways to do fertility treatment. But this particular fertility clinic would produce children through in vitro fertilization outside the course of the natural act that leads to pregnancy. And they had a number of these embryos that were not being used. I mean, that's kind of like, that's a little bit interesting in and of itself, to use the embryos.
They weren't being used. It was kind of like, Bob's already sweeping the floor in the basement. We don't need you to do that.
Yes,
Mr.
yes.
Embryo.
They weren't being put to productive use, and so they were frozen in like the cryogenic chamber of this fertility clinic or whatever. Somebody goes into it, some patient of this fertility clinic. It's unclear to me from the stories I've read what he or she was doing, but walks in, removes some of these cryogenically frozen babies, like, they're cold, drops them. Of course, they're lost. The babies, the embryos die. And so the parents of these embryos that are frozen and now deceased because they were dropped filed a wrongful death suit. There's a law in Alabama where if you wrongfully cause the death of a child, you would be held liable for it. Not criminal charges in this case, but civil charges. And so they sued the fertility clinic. Hey, you're responsible in some way for the loss of life of our children who were frozen in a freezer, but lost nonetheless, died nonetheless. And so the fertility clinic says, well, I mean, come on here, right? These are just frozen embryos. They're not actually human beings. Like, we don't apply to this law. Well, a lower court agreed with the fertility clinic, but recently, we saw just last month, the state of Alabama Supreme Court, 8-1, said, no, I mean, whatever you want to say about in vitro, you take a look at the law. The law doesn't make a distinction between children who are in the womb and children who are frozen in a laboratory. Their lives were lost either way. Ergo, these parents are entitled to the wrongful death compensation.
It's just common sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's consistent with the biological reality of the unborn child, which is why we as Mother Teresa said, from womb to tomb, from conception to natural death. This is highlighting something because we're all Catholic, and the only institution in the world that is outspoken against in vitro fertilization is the Catholic Church, and it's always been one of those Catholic teachings. Same with artificial contraception. And those are two of the Church's teaching, that and probably divorce. You can't get divorced. That it's like, they're out there. They're really nuts. But for a lot of people, it's kind of the way they discovered that Catholicism maybe wasn't as nuts as they thought, or as nuts as we know how crazy it is because we're actually in it. But it's not for the reasons they think it's nuts. And it's shown the beautiful teachings on natural law and marriage and the gift of children, and it all makes sense. What's ironic is you have politics meeting biology, meeting religion when it comes to IVF. And this was just cast off as, look, we're not for abortion. Like, we're not even getting to that. This is a good thing. People just assume that this is good in vitro. And when you explain, and I've done it a lot because we keep getting asked about it, when you explain that they make multiple embryos and then they keep one, and even that doesn't always work.
Most of the time doesn't, in fact.
Most of the time it doesn't. They're like, well, what happens to the embryos? Like, well, they're discarded or they're frozen. But we don't know how many are discarded. But there's only 600,000 frozen embryos in the United States. I mean, how many people have gone through in vitro and created 10 fertilized eggs?
Nobody knows, but the best estimates that I saw showed that if you take all the frozen embryos in the country and put them in one place, it would be like the 7th or so biggest city in America, right next to San Antonio.
So I had someone who is secular who said, I'm not Catholic. I have a lot of issues with the Catholic Church. I'm not religious. I think this is sick.
Yeah.
Like this is like Jurassic Park.
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein. And just because we could doesn't mean that we should. Okay, before we kind of get into this, you're just like man on the street experience with IVF. Do people have no issue with it? Do they not want to talk about it? Do they know what it is? Because my experience is people don't know what it is.
My experience is that people think they know what it is. And I would say for the average Christian, just based on experience and also just a little bit of what I've read on the internet from various Christian sources, that the average Christian is very much in support of IVF because it helps couples who are infertile. And why wouldn't you want people to see their families grow?
Yeah. Is it Joy Reid? Is that her name? She questioned the whole thing and said, why do we want more babies in Alabama? We don't need more babies.
Oh, that's great.
That's a different podcast topic. Number one, if we want to go there and enter her lunatic world, we're underpopulated, as we've pointed out on the podcast before with demographers. The Japanese are losing 870,000 people per year.
Closing birthing hospitals, and also adult diapers now outsell infant diapers.
Yep.
We need to have our demographer friend back on here.
We do. It's one of the best podcasts we've ever done.
Last time I talked to him, he said that I'm like, what's the long game? Because it's like hearing about the aliens invading. What are we going to do? He said we will be recruiting countries in order to survive and to keep their population up and to sustain the workforce. We'll have to recruit Africans who are the only ones reproducing. Africans are the only place where they took all of this crap from the West and said, you know what, we're poor and we don't have the health care that y'all have, but we're good.
Yeah.
We don't want to take your pills. We don't want your abortion doctors. Like, we're fine. And they're the only thriving population. We're all completely dependent on immigration. Of course, you can't get into that because the southern border is a total disaster. And the reality is, if we want to sustain our population, we don't have to have illegal immigration, but we have to have immigration. America is 1.8. We're not replacing ourselves. We used to be 2.1. 2.1 is replacing yourself. But there are places in Europe where if all of the women today had 10 kids during the rest of their life, it would have zero impact. It'd be like a little blip. They are that much in a, what's it called? Winter?
Demographic winter.
Demographic winter. There's a depressing book somewhere. But so when she says, we don't need more babies in Alabama, she went on and said they want more babies because they want slaves. It all comes back to slavery.
Naturally.
Wow.
Naturally slavery. So this whole eugenics notion that if we want a baby, we get a baby. And the difference is that we don't do that with all other families. People don't say, in order to get a girl, we're trading in our two sons. Although based on how they behave, sometimes that'd be a good deal. But we don't do that. We don't trade siblings in for a healthy child. But that's what in vitro requires.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And it's a commodification of the human person, which is tragic. We said before, like you talk about the unused embryos. So in what situation would we ever consider it okay to use a human being? And this is where we sometimes get into the weeds a little bit. Like, yes, in the process of in vitro fertilization, they are creating excess embryos. Again, terminology is interesting here. Excess human beings. Mother Teresa, how can there be too many human beings? That's like there's too many flowers. But there's more than get used. They get frozen or they get discarded or they get experimented on for scientific research purposes. All these are bad things. And someone will come up with a gotcha. What about, let's say, we're only going to create 2 embryos and we'll implant both of them and that way none will be frozen or discarded. There's still a real moral problem here because this is still in many ways somewhat akin to human trafficking. We don't always know who the parents are of these embryos. Bottom line is, I think children deserve to be conceived by their own parents in the context of the marital act. And now that we've got children who are old enough, they're in their adults, their 20s and their 30s, who are conceived via in vitro, many of them are coming forward and acknowledging that, like, this is I'm happy I exist, but this is weird and it's not right.
We've said weird as a category, and I've met snowflake children, and I know we have people who listen who have adopted a snowflake baby. A snowflake baby is when you adopt a frozen embryo. They thaw the embryo out, and you raise little Tommy. And so one kid I met at the time, he was conceived 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. He was 7. He'd been thawed out 7 years.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It is weird.
It's weird. And he's telling everybody this. And this is why you can bash the Catholic Church or whatever, but that's unnatural. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean I think we should take him out and shoot him.
Right.
But that's not the point. The point is that when you engage in this and you remove the whole thing from God's plan, but even remove it from the natural order, you're playing with fire. You're playing with fire. And, there's no, you mentioned the adults, and that actually is a problem. And I know now we get hit over the head with that because it's like some guy grew up and he was supposed to be a girl and now he's depressed and we're supposed to support trans rights because he's depressed now. And everybody has those stories. When they get to be adults, they really regret it. Although in the trans thing, it's the opposite when they're adults. But these kids, these adults, there's an identity problem there.
Yeah.
That we're not going to get into, but it's not free. And that's not the reason to be against it. The reason to be against it is because you're engineering humans outside of nature.
It's like manufacturing in a sense. We talk about creating life in a lab.
Right.
That sounds kind of sketchy, but in many ways it's manufacturing life in a lab.
And when we do it, we have to acknowledge that's what we're doing. And if you're going to manufacture a life, you've created a life through this process. That life should get legal protection. Mm-hmm. And everybody's saying no to the state of Alabama. Alabama's doing the most common sense thing. I think it's brilliant. I saw the headline. I thought it was too good to be true because it is so consistent with the pro-life message that if New York and California are going to lose their minds and they want to do abortion at 40 weeks, they want to take some little girl who survives an abortion, they want her to suffocate on the table, they want to do what Governor Northam said, and we're going to talk to the family and make the baby comfortable and let that kid die. If they're going to do that insanity, then we can go the other extreme and protect the child from at the most vulnerable stages, which is, an embryo. So I think Alabama is doing the common sense thing here, and I don't know why Trump and everybody else is criticizing him. I don't think they know what to say, and he continues to just run into walls on the pro-life issue. But I think it's great, and I know Governor Abbott, where we are, already said he's going to look at Texas doing the same thing.
Yeah. I love how the Alabama justices, when you read some of their opinions on this, you had mentioned in the background, Steve, that it's the wrongful death of a minor act is what the Supreme Court basically said. Yes, this does apply to embryos. And so one of the quotes was, the wrongful death of a minor act applies to all unborn children, regardless of their location, which I was like, yes, that's what we've been saying this whole time about abortion, that human life is valuable and has dignity and should be protected no matter what their location is. So I love that.
It's unborn children are children without exception based on development stage, physical location, or any other ancillary characteristics.
How about that?
Awesome.
This is the thing where it's so surprising is you see a lot of well-intended Christians coming out against this decision from the Supreme Court. Like, but we need IVF. And that becomes, again, a situation where even if they're pro-life otherwise, or their hearts are in the right place, they love the Lord, they love their families, they're still missing the basic anthropology of it here. That this isn't a question of, we're not evaluating IVF on what you get out of it and what you don't get out of it. This key central tenet and question is, what is the embryo? What is it? And that everything else needs to hinge on that. And if you can say that outside the womb, freeze it, inside the womb, protect it, there's something very fractured in your logic.
Yeah, I think it's because it's personal for people. And we all know someone who's from IVF. and they're a relative or a friend or whatever, and people are like, no, but I know you don't know John, and it's just, that's not the point, as you pointed out. But I will tell you, and this goes, you don't even have to ask. There is, just to show kind of how it's unnatural on a day-to-day thing, there's always an asterisk. The couple will always be like, we did it in vitro. Like, they'll mention it, or the person will tell you, yeah, they had a baby. Oh, that's awesome. I know they were struggling. They did it in vitro. Like, we already, I would say, kind of put it in a condescending category. It's not like they did it in vitro. That's awesome and it worked. It's always like, they did it in vitro.
I've even heard relatives, grandparents struggling with, should I go to my daughter-in-law's baby shower because this child was conceived through in vitro, which, of course you should celebrate the baby.
Right.
Like, it's
You're
not.
gonna go to the birthday party
right.
later?
Like, you celebrate the baby, and that's not at all the message that I think any true reasonable pro-lifer would want to put out there, that the baby has dignity no matter what. So
we've got this quote here because there's huge backlash, right? And right now, those of us who are pro-life and we're supporting the decision made by the Alabama Supreme Court, we're looked at like we're crazy, like we're Amish or something. We've got commentary from University of California Davis historian Mary Ziegler, who said, the point, I think, for the pro-life movement was never just getting rid of Roe v. Wade. It was always to achieve fetal personhood. Like, are we supposed to be like, no, it's not? Like, yeah, we've been pretty open with that the whole time for the last 50 years. The only reason that we're pro-life is because we believe the unborn child is a human being. Of course, that's our goal.
yeah, we recognize that.
What if the pro-life movement came out tomorrow and said, we don't believe these are children? And we like join the pro-choice people in that we don't know when life begins. How do you prove that? Like, how do we take conception? How do we take the National Geographic unbelievable documentary? Like, how do we disprove our point? If we wanted to change sides today, I want to become an anti-womber. You're in the womb, I could care less about you. You're not real. We can't prove that. And then at the same time, as we've said time and time again, do a surgery on unborn children, not let the women go on roller coasters, all this garbage. It's just that if you don't live with your head in the sand and you look at the biological reality of us, it started at conception. That's when it happened. Not because we believe it, not because Moses told us or Jesus or St. Thomas Aquinas, because that's what happens. We know life begins at conception. So why are the people who want to protect it from that point the crazies?
This is where I think pro-lifers get so frustrated because we see, whether it be in vitro, abortion, anything having to do with a life issue, a lot of these debates that we have can be very frustrating because we're like, well, just look at the logic. I mean, they have to know.
Yeah.
And I sometimes tell pro-lifers, like, we need to not get too caught up in the logic. We have it, we recognize it, it's important. But if you're looking for logic in the pro-abortion movement, or in this case, in the pro-in vitro movement, it's not to be found. This is just pure might makes right. We can, so we will. No one's going to stop us. You're not going to stop us. And I think it's just a matter of what are you getting out of it. People have something that they want. In this case, it's a very laudable thing to desire, to be able to welcome new children. But that doesn't make anything that you do to achieve that goal acceptable.
So you're saying that this Alabama decision was not a mistake?
It was not a mistake.
It was not a mistake. Okay, so here's the Associated Press. Doctors and patients have been grappling with shock and fear this week. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Is that because Saban retired? That's why they should be grappling with shock and fear, because Saban retired.
I kind of put this line in the outline because it shows how biased the reporting is. Like, undoubtedly it's true, but can you imagine, let's say that somewhere they're instituting a buffer zone against pro-lifers. You can't talk about pro-life messages within 100 yards of an abortion facility. I don't think you'd see the Associated Press come out with the article that says free speech advocates are grappling with fear and shock. No, these are loaded terms that are put in right away at the beginning of an article to really sway everybody. Like, oh man, fear, shock, something must be done.
Okay, what about when Dr. Martin Haskell opened his late-term abortion facility in Sharonville, Ohio, and described to the world what a partial birth abortion entails. And we've been to Sharonville. It's like this cute, quaint little town, and they're going to dismember these children in this nice little town.
Fear and shock was not in the article.
Yeah, fear, shock, and awe. Toby Keith, God rest his soul. Like all of the fear mongering, you know, and it only works, you know, kind of for one side. Also, I don't know if not having in vitro is going to cause fear and shock, unless they're talking about the money they're going to lose.
Well, yeah, the money. I mean, there's thousands of dollars
and
per couple.
I hate this, and we have to do it because there's a ton of money in this stuff, and we all know that that's what drives it. But I'm not a big, and they're making money off of it, therefore it's bad. Like, you get people that are more angry that tax dollars go to Planned Parenthood than the fact that Planned Parenthood does abortions. You're like,
well, that point exposes the fact that this is not altruism.
Sure. Well, they're not charities. Yeah. It's a lot of money. It's very expensive to do in vitro. You know, one of the most beautiful things that I've seen, it's happened 3 times. 4. So there's a lot of couples that won't do in vitro. This is like a trend, kind of like the health. I don't want the fake stuff, like the organic thing. It's not religious necessarily, but there's just sort of a, you're going to create a bunch of embryos, and then I've got to go to bed at night knowing I've got 3 frozen kids in some factory in Illinois. So people reject it from that standpoint. And of course, like natural family planning and all this. But the ones who dabble in it, who get out and say this isn't working, we don't feel good about it, they give up, they're frustrated, and then they have a baby miraculously. And a lot of times it is miraculous. Have you ever met one of those kids? So when they tried to do in vitro, it didn't work. They kind of gave up, let go, let God, and they have a baby.
Naturally. Yes, I have.
That is the best rejection of all this garbage, because you're basically, and you mentioned, that Sean, that's logical and it makes sense, but no one cares. And you're right. But this is, what it is it's a forfeiting of hope. That if God wants you to have a baby, you're going to have a baby, but you've got to trust him. And once you do IVF, you've just kind of thrown in the towel. I mean, it is not, and it's a frustrating process. There's a lot of failure. You just keep creating embryos. That takes a toll. And it's awesome when you see couples that they're like, we're not doing this anymore. And mainly it's usually the anxiety from the mom. Because it's like you get your hopes up and then it just doesn't happen. And they're like, we're done. And then they have a baby. And their whole perspective of IVF totally changes. Totally changes. Because they would have never gone for this crap if they knew there was any chance that they could conceive a child.
Sure.
And God bless Dr. Hilgers in Omaha. And my father-in-law was trained with them. What's the name of the Paul VI
Institute.
Yes, Institute.
Naprotechnology. Got 4 kids from that.
Yes. You're an example of this. But like,
I've lost all my credibility as like the infertile couple guy.
I was trying to like hide you. So you're like, I'm coming at this from an objective point of view. But we've had no fertility issues. Praise God. You had like the extreme, and now are blessed with all these kids. So it is 2 perspectives, but there's something really awesome about meeting a child whose parents gave up on IVF, trusted God, or just submitted their life to his will. Maybe we're not, we can't have kids. We can't have kids. We're not entitled to kids.
That's the crux of it, though, right there, isn't it? Like, I think the main, like the most common and frequent popular theological position in our country right now is God wants me to be happy. This would make me happy. Therefore, God is in favor of this. And that's a really dangerous place because you can justify anything at that point.
Yes, I was just going to say that.
And those people in Alabama who that ding-dong went in there and dropped the Petri dish or whatever and shattered their children on some lab floor, I promise you those people were thinking about those embryos before then. It's just always in your mind. we know we have 4 frozen kids in this lab.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a small thing, you know, and that's why if you just take the position, which is humiliating, if you're dying for a child, we've been blessed with 9 pregnancies, we have 8 living children, it's awesome, but when we don't take any of them for granted, we're not entitled to children, and I can't imagine not being able to have children. That would be a huge cross. But it's a cross that is there for a reason. And when you see these couples that finally kind of get their breaking point and then they have a baby, it's awesome. I've heard couples speak on it. Like the Alexanders are a great example. But, you know, it's a very powerful testimonial. And I think that kind of stuff, because those people are like, you hear them at like some Christian conference and you're like, yeah, that was interesting. They did IVF and regretted it. I didn't really get it, but it's neat. And they have a son now. But what Alabama's doing is going to highlight all this.
Right. And there's going to be a lot of couples out there who are not going to be able to ever experience. They're going to have the failed IVF and then they're not going to be able to conceive naturally even after they've given up. So I think for that reason and many other reasons, there's a lot of people out there that still believe this is a mistake. I want to point out for instance, there is a professor named Dov Fox of San Diego School of Law. Treating embryos more like persons will ultimately result in fewer people born and fewer families formed. This is because the success of a procedure like IVF depends in large part on being able to select from among multiple embryos the ones most likely to implant and develop into a child. The more restricted that cohort of embryos, the lower the chances of ending up with a baby to take home. So therefore, I think this is the logic behind a lot of people's reason for objecting to being against IVF. So
it's a dangerous thing in many ways. I think about the children who are conceived through IVF. When you use this Dove Fox guy saying we're gonna pick the most fit ones, the ones that are this pure eugenics right here. And so you've been conceived, you were born, you were chosen of all the frozen siblings, you were the most worthy. That would bother me a little bit to be that child, because at that point, my parents don't love me, didn't choose me, didn't want me because I have inherent value as their child, as a human being, but because I had certain traits that they found to be most beneficial. Yeah. It's like picking out like 9 out of 10 dentists prefer this toothpaste.
Okay, here's the argument against that, and this is what maybe our listeners or some of the viewers are thinking. No, I want kids. I control my own embryos, my own eggs. We can fertilize however we want. You can stay out of our bedroom and our lab. And I absolutely adore my children. I love them. I don't neglect them because they're one of the chosen eggs. I chose them. I paid a fortune for them. I decided to, do everything possible so they could exist. And I have given my life, time, and treasure to them. I love them dearly. And I don't lay awake at night thinking about my 4 frozen embryos. They're my property. They're from my body.
What do you care?
What do you care? Yeah. So that's the argument. And then they will, this is what's so brilliant about having a consistent teaching on natural law. They will cling to the living child. There he is playing 8th grade football. You don't think he should exist. And they will highlight the beauty that is life in raising children. And they do not want to acknowledge the frozen ones or the process. And that's not consistent. They don't want to acknowledge that they have conceived children that are frozen, that I guess they could try to thaw out. They could try to, but they're most likely not going to survive. And that's why the process is immoral. The process is immoral. The result can be beautiful. But I'm not going to go out and say, well, we need to go out and rape a bunch of people because children may be conceived. Mm-hmm. And that is they don't think that a good can come from an evil. And we think that it can.
Yeah.
But we're not going to use that to justify the
Condoning
evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is something that people would just, as you said, prefer not to think about. Like, these kids are there in the lab. We don't think about them. We think about the born ones. This is what's such a big deal about
Or sorry to cut you off, or they won't acknowledge that they do think about it.
Yes, and now the Alabama Supreme Court has forced the question.
Yes.
Now
Yes.
people have to reckon with it. I mean, they can come down any which way they want on the issue, but they can't ignore the question right now.
Yeah.
That's why I think it's good. And even people, if you totally disagree with us, which is probably going to be a significant amount of people, and it's just this cold-hearted thing, this is still worthy of, as we say, we need to have the conversation. And IVF's never wanted to have the conversation. And this is the reality. We're creating people so that we can get one, and the rest are discarded. So if that's just supposed to be normal and virtuous, then we need to have that conversation. But this is not controversial, you know?
Yeah. I really think get is an operative word, just as we said use was. I mean, this is sort of like this Dove Fox guy. It sort of is like CarMax, but for babies. Like, yeah, I'd like a two-door manual transmission.
Now I'm thinking of Carfax for Carfax.
Ah, yes.
Because you mentioned Dove Fox. I'm lost.
The worlds are colliding.
Yes. Okay, so here we go. Barbara Kalura? She is CEO of Resolve, the National Infertility Association. By insisting that these very different biological entities are legally equivalent, the best state-of-the-art fertility care will be made unavailable to the people of Alabama.
That's one of those things that sounds somewhat compelling, right? Yeah, they're biologically different. What does that mean? What does biologically different mean? We just did a podcast a few weeks ago where the abortion supporters were getting so hypercritical on language, like late-term abortion is a made-up term. Okay, then what is biologically different? Because they still have 23 pairs of human chromosomes. That embryo, even so small, maybe at a microscopic level, is still biologically more similar to an adult human than is a chimpanzee or a duck.
That's not the worst part of this. Sorry. You saying duck.
Yeah,
it's funny.
Duck is just funny.
Okay,
I don't know
just
why.
a funny word with your accent. Okay. By insisting that these very different biological entities.
Okay, so
What's a biological entity?
Right.
Like a cockroach? A biological entity. That's like what's the dinosaur in Jurassic World? What do they call it? Where's John Franklin? Yeah, what's the name of the big T-Rex thing that they name them? My kids know. In Jurassic World. And what's his face? Chris Pratt's like, depends on what kind of dinosaur they cooked up in that lab. And he's got a long name, but it's basically like he's a biological entity. Is a dinosaur. I don't know why they don't tug at the heart and be like, the state of Alabama hates children, or something just dramatic.
well, don't worry, that'll come
Okay,
later
that'll
on.
come later.
But what I actually stuck on was the best state of the art fertility care. How is that the best fertility care when you're not even trying to get to the root of the problems that couples have? That's what I stuck on.
Yeah, IVF has been used a lot. It's remarkable in how low the success rate is.
Right.
In
Yeah.
fact, like things that are much more, much less technological have higher success rates.
It wears people out. It wears people out emotionally.
Yeah.
And it's a long process that is kind of doomed to fail that costs a fortune.
You talked about like just how disturbing it is to refer to these frozen children as biological entities. That's not the most disturbing way I've heard it phrased. There was a lawsuit between a couple where they like separated, divorced, whatever, and they had conceived children who remained frozen in a lab somewhere. And there was a lawsuit about what to do with the fate of these embryos, and the lawsuit was over the genetic material.
That's like the what was my favorite cardiac activity.
Yes.
The heartbeat bill. These children do not have heartbeats. They merely have cardiac activity. And you're like,
Yeah.
That sounds like a heartbeat.
Earlier in this campaign, Sean, you sent out an email to our whole list and was talking about, these lies that are told. And one of them was some news article had a story like, and whoever, like doctors agree that children don't even have hearts at this age. And I was like, before we call that a lie, I better just kind of like go and double check what we're putting out in this email. And first Google search result is like National Institutes of Health study on like the heart beginning beating at whatever 3 weeks that we say it begins at.
Right. No, American Heart Association. I mean, I think the heart's pretty important to them.
Yeah.
They say that it starts at 3 weeks. So we got to cover some basic apologetics with our SLED.
SLED acronym.
SLED.
It's a very good pro-life apologetics acronym. So size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. And this is essentially a concept that is used to help us clearly define in a short and sweet manner the differences between the child that's in the womb and the child that is out of the womb. We're not talking about, a child that's 2 months in the womb the parent is bonded less to that than a 2-year-old child. That's exterior. We're talking about the actual child. And so literally it's just the 2-year-old's bigger, they're developed further, they're outside of the womb, and they depend on the mother less, but they still depend on the mother. But now the embryo in the frozen state in the fertility lab is outside of the womb.
Yeah, that's all the Supreme Court here in Alabama is saying, right? They're saying the environment, it's a different environment, but we're going to treat it the same way. It doesn't matter where you are. It matters what and who you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're going to get to is IVF pro-life, and then we're going to get to we're alone on this section, which is the Republicans are caving section of this podcast.
We're having a good month for those of us who sometimes think we're too friendly to Republicans. This is
all of you people who hate Trump and Republicans who are always mad at us. You must love us this March.
Your time to shine.
This is your time to shine. You better write in and tell us how great we are, actually. So, okay, is IVF pro-life? Here we go. Fertility Institute of North Alabama, Dr. Brett Davenport. See, he's got a normal name.
This must be more legit.
No animals in his first or last name.
What we do could not be any more pro-life. Here it comes. We're trying to help couples who can't otherwise conceive a child. I am very pro-life, yet this still seems quite absurd to me. So this is where it's the misguided view that we're gonna be more pro-life than you, which is how we're gonna kill people. And this is kind of a trend. We care about rape victims, therefore we believe rape victims should have an abortion. We care about children with disabilities more than you. You want them to have a life of suffering. We just want to kill them.
We just got an email. Tell me how pro-life you are when you start opposing gun violence. Find me someone who's in favor of gun violence. We're not in favor of gun violence.
Who is in favor of gun violence? It's just, who's in favor of racism? Who's the pro-racist candidate right now? So I guess they would say it's Trump. But yeah, here's what's great about this quote from old Brett, because he's the doctor, he's at the Fertility Institute, is he doesn't know what to say. Mm-hmm. Because he's entering our world. He's saying, no, this is like the Planned Parenthood workers who are like, I go to church. And they should never, who cares? Do what you want. You don't justify your job to me. You don't have to talk about how you're a deacon at your church or how you believe in God. You read your Bible every day, when you wake up.
12 years of Catholic school.
12 years of Catholic school. When they start to do that, there's something wrong. And he needs to be like, I'm a medical doctor. And these people are morons. And we help families here. And they're going to stop us. He should just say that.
We're allowing more children to be born, and what could be more pro-life than that?
When he says, I'm very pro-life.
Yes.
He has to say that because he knows how many embryos he's discarded.
They really think we are dumb because I think they sometimes believe their own rhetoric. They just want as many babies as possible. And obviously, if we did, we'd be like, yeah, let's be having all the in vitro we can.
It is a funny thing with that. Yeah. I don't know if we're allowed to laugh on this podcast, but there is that. Well, I thought we wanted to just have everybody have babies everywhere.
Yeah.
We should have government-funded IVF. Everybody's required to thaw out 9 kids in a year, if we just want babies everywhere. And no, it's there's another argument of like, we're the ones that are hung up about sex, yet we're the ones that want sex to result in babies.
Yes. You guys hate it, but you all have too many kids.
Exactly.
This is where they get off track too with their crazy Handmaid's Tale fantasy. Like
Yes.
they just think women are nothing but wombs. Well, you know what? I know not all IVF takes place through surrogates, but you've got eggs being harvested from poor women in India. You've got wombs being rented from poor women in the third world. All these things. If there's a Handmaid's Tale, it is the infertility industry in a big way.
There's, I thought this was interesting in reading a lot up on this and hearing from women who have gone through the IVF process. Some of them grappling with all of this now, some of them totally fine with what they did, and some of them very, very regretful. This one patient said, finding a pro-life fertility doctor willing to go with their convictions was like the Underground Railroad, a very hush-hush network. And in her mind, what a pro-life fertility doctor was a doctor that was willing to only harvest eggs and fertilize the ones that they will implant. So not having any extra embryos that will be placed on ice.
That's the question too. People say, well, isn't there a way to do this
Ethically, yeah.
and not have the extra
Yeah.
embryos?
It does happen. I mean, I know someone
It does happen.
who did that.
It just takes the percentage from very low to darn near impossible. And so couples are like, well, forget it. Let's just do it.
Yeah.
And the doctors know that it's, highly unsuccessful. So no one.
Even if it were, though, this is one of those things where let's say it's totally successful. You don't need all the embryos. We came up with some method. There's still the commodification, the dehumanization, we're evaluating them by their, it's still.
Yeah.
The commodification is a real argument that I think people are like, come on. But you can't say this. It's like a commodity. It's, you use the, not to the extreme, but the trafficking, like we're just sort of trading out people here and trying to create through any means. And I think people get that. I've just met too many IVF couples who were successful, many more who were not, who just never felt good about it. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah.
And maybe we're gonna hear from doing this podcast. Well, you're gonna hear from me. Yeah, it was a blessing in my life, and I've got 3 kids. And we want to hear from you.
And we're happy that your children exist.
Absolutely. We're not saying that. But more often than not, my experience has been it was just off.
So I think the whole point of this is, to combat what these physicians and these school of law people are saying, that this is super pro-life. How could you pro-lifers be against this? Just to reiterate the points, we've got the issue of embryos being discarded, which are human children, or being frozen until, for many, many years, sometimes decades, until they no longer have their shelf life expires, which happens. And what's scary is, you had mentioned before, Steve, about the battle between couples who end up separating, getting divorced. These children are up until now, and still in most places, are considered property. They're not considered
the genetic material.
The genetic material. They're not considered. This isn't a custody battle. It's a property battle, and the judge gets to decide whether or not the one party can take the frozen embryos and implant them and try to give them a chance at life, or whether they can be destroyed. Sofia Vergara was a celebrity who was involved with that situation, which was really, really sad. But this is really crazy that you're talking about human beings being considered property. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah. It's because they're little and they're unborn, and it's the sled argument, location and size.
And I want to point, since you mentioned the women in India, this ad that one of the many just disturbing ads.
This is an online ad.
This is an online ad that is advertising for surrogacy. We have over 100 surrogates in our agency available to carry your baby. Another reads 40 to 70% less than U.S. programs. Don't wait. A third says same sex, want a baby, as seen on TV. We provide low-cost surrogates in India. So a lot of women in foreign countries are exploited through this. And then you have the whole issue.
So the two gay dudes are going to go and find an Indian woman.
Quite possibly.
Put the baby in the Indian
And it's going to be
lady.
cheaper for them to do that than it would be to get an American woman.
Good value.
Yeah. And that, okay.
That's a tough middle school conversation.
So this is all
By the way, Ukraine's the #1 country for this.
Oh, we've now gone this far. We've pushed science this far, and we've said we can, so we will. And all this is doing is creating it seems like endless more problems. Now what happens when your 20-week appointment for this surrogate mother finds that this child has some sort of disability, and this is not what the parents signed up for?
This happens a lot.
So you need to get an abortion. Now the woman, and this is not just the baby suffers, the woman suffers from the abortion, and she may not want to get the abortion, most likely doesn't. So now she's caught in being forced to have an abortion, which I thought was illegal.
And they now sometimes have to flee to states as though it's like the Fugitive Slave Act or something. Where like, we're going to this state which will not like extradite, I don't know if that's the right term, but like basically enforce the abortion provision of the surrogacy contract.
And the surrogate mom will then say, no, growing this baby, I don't care if she has Down syndrome. I now want to adopt the child from you.
Yeah.
And they say, you can't do that. You have to have an abortion. There was a famous case where actually I was going to put it in What to Say When, but it was so complicated and long. I was like, okay, we have our book. This is too complicated of an example. But it's kind of the worst example. And they try to bribe her with $5,000 to abort their own baby. She won't do it. They bribe her with $10,000. She won't do it. They sue her, take her to court, and force her to have the abortion.
This is what,
and that baby had Downs.
We all have a mutual friend who used to work in the abortion industry. I'll leave her name out of it. But whereas the in vitro conversation is kind of like, in many ways, the last thing people are willing to accept the pro-life argument on, this was what made her pro-life in the first place. She read an article about one of these cases where the woman was offered payment of her contract in full to abort the baby when they found out the baby had special needs. And I'll never forget this woman, our friend, looking at me and saying, and she did. And that's what brought her over. She became pro-life, and she like has this beautiful reflection on the children who are frozen. She refers to them as the cold souls because they're there on ice.
There's some more testimonies from IVF moms that I wanted to include. So here's one. This mom says, as a pro-life Christian, I thought primarily of the lives I would carry, not the ethical ramifications of potential leftover embryos. In fact, I wasn't even aware one could make so many embryos at once, and the doctors at my IVF clinic didn't inform me of it. And another mom says, the remaining embryos I have stored on ice have caused great heartache. Going to your point.
That's the sentence. The remaining embryos I've stored on ice have caused great heartache. So when somebody says, how can you tell someone not to do this? That's the sentence I always think of. They always have a level of regret, and it's natural. How are you not going to think about these frozen embryos?
And what's the process here? Like, do you think that these places are just storing them like out of the goodness of their hearts?
Oh.
You're paying a fee. And when you quit paying the fee, then what? It's not like, is this like the Storage Wars show where you open up the storage locker and auction it off?
Goodness.
It obviously isn't, but we see a lot of weird stuff happening. The whole debate, I don't feel like you hear all that much about embryonic stem cell research anymore, but that's where it comes from the babies who are frozen and they're done with them.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's move on to Republicans who don't know what to say and are probably also listening to people who don't know what to say. This is just brutal. All right. Here was Trump. Like the overwhelming majority of Americans, including the vast majority of Republicans, conservatives, Christians, and pro-life Americans, I strongly support the availability of IVF for couples who are trying to have a precious baby.
I can't believe you didn't do that in the Trump voice.
No,
That's how sad it is. You couldn't even do the Trump
sad.
voice.
Trump voice.
We use the Trump voice for happy things.
And Trump, my issue with Trump on this, he should have never commented. He doesn't need to comment. And if he does comment, he needs to say, I love the people of Alabama. They know what they're doing. They know it's a very pro-life state. It's a great place. And move on. It's back to the states. Like he just keeps talking and commenting on stuff. The pro-life movement absolutely loves Donald Trump. He's the most pro-life president ever. And it's like he's reading a book saying, how do I alienate the pro-life movement?
Yeah, there's a real danger of him going from the most pro-life president ever to running the least pro-life campaign of a Republican since Roe v. Wade.
Yes. Nikki Haley.
You know you're going to get something good here.
We can all agree, Steve, that we don't need to give women the death penalty for having an abortion. Ugh. What? When she said that, I was like, she's like horrible. It's like they're putting words into our mouth.
This one's worse.
Using their stereotype against us. Okay. Nikki Haley. Our goal is to always do what the parents want with their embryo.
Really?
I will say to her credit, she said, I believe embryos are babies.
But then she came back and said this.
I know, but that's just what she does. She just contradicts herself. We really need a rise of good people running for office. I mean, just to say that out loud. I know that's so obvious, but like, we're hurting.
The classic line that you don't really want someone to have power who wants the power. That's our danger here.
No, and there were, when Hillary was running, I heard a lot of liberals say this because, of course, they like hated Hillary. And they're like, we just need to do better than this, you know? And I think
8 years later, Trump, Biden, part 2.
I know. I'm sorry. And I know I shouldn't actually beat up on them. They don't know what they're talking about with this, you know, and IVF's very confusing. And they're like, a lot of people have kids from IVF. I don't understand what they're doing.
Can't be that bad.
But they said this right off the bat, and there's no consideration. What about those people? What about the people whose embryos got dropped on the floor? I mean, they're not thinking about what it is they're commenting on. And I'm sitting here, Brian Kemp, why is he commenting?
Brian. I like Brian Kemp.
I do too.
I've never said anything bad about him until this podcast.
I like Brian Kemp. Yeah. You have a lot of people out there in this country that wouldn't have children if it weren't for that.
True.
No crap.
Also true of
babies who've conceived and rape.
Yeah. But of course, that's absurd to most people, and you can't put that in the same category and blah, 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 blah. But this is just an issue that our country's never really talked about or discussed on any in-depth level. It's one of those we just kind of accept it, and it all seems fine. And
isn't technology great?
It's like in the 90s, Steve, when they told us sugar is good and fat is bad, and we couldn't eat cheese, and we couldn't have real cream in our coffee, and all this stuff. And now, sugar's bad, and fat's good.
You're pulling on the heartstrings with the cheese reference.
I know. Look at how you were depraved as a child because you had to
Oh, it didn't stop me.
ration your cheese curds. Oh, my gosh. Okay. Here we go. All right, we're out of time. All right, here's the conclusion. Earlier this year, Pew Research Center found that 42% of Americans have used fertility treatments such as IVF or know someone who has. What is that?
Right.
Or know someone who has. How do they get these?
It's kind of the stat that's made up to be like, everybody.
Everybody's doing it. There are more than 1 million frozen embryos on ice, according to biotech and IVF companies. See, the number that's getting thrown around is 600,000.
I'm hearing a million a lot. I haven't heard 600,000.
I've seen more than that even.
Really?
It has to be more than that.
But think about how unregulated this is. We just heard the quote from the woman who didn't even know that they were creating a bunch of embryos.
Yeah.
And then what we can't say enough, every child conceived by IVF is a human being truly deserving of respect and love regardless of the manner of conception.
Yep.
It's about dignity of the human person, right? This is our kind of common thread here. They try to say, like, you're not pro-life, you're just a pro-controlling women's bodies, as though I have time to waste on that sort of thing. Or you're just whatever. They come up with all the reasons that we're pro-life, but they never seem to like really touch on what it's all about, which is the dignity of the human person. That's why we do this podcast. That's why we go out and pray in front of abortion facilities. That's why we do everything that we do at 40 Days for Life, is because human beings have dignity, and all we ask is that they be treated as such.
And the way you come into the world is part of your dignity. Mm-hmm. It's part of your dignity. Okay.
Everyone deserves a birthday, so celebrate the birthdays, no matter what. This is a great, actually, example of being pro-birth for us. We're pro-birth of all the embryos that are. We want them to make it to birth.
Yeah, I've never denied being pro-birth. I'm just not pro-forced birth, and I'm not limited to pro-birth. I'm pro-everything, except for IVF.
We're going to be covering it in future things, but you don't care about the born children.
Yeah,
I'm on this kick. I'm getting this a lot. This is my favorite one.
Yeah.
It's my favorite one. We'll save it for another podcast, but y'all just know Steve doesn't care about born children.
On that note.
Okay, so please write us, email us. This is definitely one of the podcasts where a lot of people say, I've never thought about this before. We do have a chapter on this and what to say when, if you want to get the book. We have a chapter that breaks this down. We actually got a lot of good feedback on that from people who had never thought about IVF before. And so hopefully this was helpful. We took a practical approach and a sort of a IVF is bad 101 approach to this podcast. So
you also have a previous podcast, season 4, episode 29. Y'all touched on this topic. So if people want to review that, they can go back and listen to you.
We'll put that link in there.
Robert and Steve.
Robert and Steve. We'll put that link in there. You can check that out. But this is not going away. I know Greg Abbott in Texas said Texas is going to look at doing the same thing. So this is what happens in a post-Roe world. We start thinking about what we're doing and what we're not doing. And if we follow science, not the science, but science, it leads to this sort of common sense stuff that Alabama is doing. So please rate, review, share this podcast, and we will see you next time. God bless you.